Hello everybody, today we're going to talk about conservatism. Now we've already tossed out the ideas that liberalism is a big piece in Europe during this time period. The French Revolution is inspiring of liberalism and nationalism. Well, there has to of course be a response to these growing movements across the European continent. And that growing movement is going to be known as conservatism. And conservatism during this time period is characterized by a desire to maintain tradition in the face of change. So in their mindset, they are trying to keep things the way they are, most likely the way they were prior to the French Revolution. But even if it's just as it is right now in regards to keeping new change from taking place, that's the goal of conservatism. Keep things the way they are, keep the status quo. Alright, so what does this mean? Well, it means that you're going to have legitimate monarchies in Europe, much like what characterized the Congress of Vienna. You're going to see people really looking to maintain the established society that existed. That means there's going to be a strong importance on the aristocracy still. You're going to want established churches in these nations, and you're going to have monarchies and dynasties that the nations are familiar with. So what does this mean for the social dynamics of Europe? Well, conservatism is actually going to unite groups that have been competing for a long time now. You're going to see the church really rally behind the efforts of kings and queens, which is a conflict that we had seen popping up numerous times over the course of the last 200 years. And we're also going to see more of a unified effort by nobility and kings. Aristocracies are not going to be, driving efforts in what's going on anymore. They're going to be working with kings to maintain their authority, their goals, their responsibilities. So, what does this kind of mean for nationalism and liberalism? It means nothing happens. No, 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 no. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a little bit of a case study of conservatism across Europe, hitting each of these different areas and looking at how they respond to conservatism or respond to nationalism and liberalism across the European continent. Alright, so first up in our agenda list is Austria, and this map really does delineate the challenges that Austria has during this time period. There are tons of different ethnicities and national groups within the Austrian Empire. And many of these peoples have now been inspired by the nationalist movements that took place in Spain, in Portugal, in France, and are really looking for that autonomy, that independence that the rest of Europe received. Well, this is going to be a struggle. We know who Clemens von Metternich is. He is the guy who really articulated what happened during the Congress of Vienna, and he's still largely influential in Austria at this time period. So when we see liberalism start to break up, or pop up in Austrian-controlled territories, he's immediately going to go out of his way to try to stomp them down. Where this really takes hold is going to be in the German Confederation. If you remember from prior lessons, the German Confederation is a group of territories that is now under Austrian control after the Congress of Vienna. And a lot of these different German peoples are going to be inspired by the ideas of nationalism and liberalism. So how does this all play out? Well, what we have here is a Prussian state. A Prussian state that is just to the north of Austria. And they are their own unified country. Life is great for them, but they're having some unrest in their country during this time period. And it has to do with rulers not carrying out the promises that they made to the peoples of their nation. So let's look at Prussia. After Napoleon is driven out of Prussia, and what the Prussians call the War of Liberation, the Prussian king Frederick William III promised to write a new constitution that was more liberally based, that would allow for the people to have representation in a parliament, and this would kind of rein in some of the monarchical control of Prussia. Well, he doesn't do that. He never writes this new constitution. What he does do, though, is create diets, and these diets are supposed to be German parliaments that are supposed to allow the people to have a voice. Well, not coincidentally, these diets are going to be dominated by the German aristocracy, the Junkers. And these Junkers don't want change. In fact, they're going to use this new, what is designed to be this liberal institution, as a way to maintain conservative control over Prussia. And the people are not exactly happy about this. But the Junkers are laughing at them. There's more to the story, though. What ends up happening is that the college campuses of the German Confederation are livid to this establishment, this this idea that conservatism is going to dominate their lives. So what they do is they start to hold protests on college campuses. And if you remember back from the Reformation, you already knew back then that college campuses and universities were a pretty significant role in the German lifestyle during this time period. So when these protests start becoming larger and larger and larger, and they start organizing together into what we call the Burschenschaften, things start to become a little chaotic. At one of these student protests, we actually see a prominent individual who is outspoken in his hatred of these movements. He's a very conservative individual in the German Confederation. His name is August von Kutby. And von Kutby is actually going to be held on trial by these student protests. And one of the leaders of the student protests, named Karl Sand, is going to kill him. He's going to chop off his head in a public demonstration of the hatred of conservatism in the German Confederation. Well, what started in Prussia as frustration over a governmental move to become more conservative bled into the German Confederation and to the college campuses there, and now the Austrians are forced to act on this. And Clemens von Metternich is going to act on this very quickly. This is the lighting of the powder keg that he has to stomp out immediately before it all blows up. So he passes the Carlsbad Decrees. These decrees will outlaw the student movement, the Burschenschaften, and actually provide for approved censorship of college campuses. Anything that is deemed inappropriate by inspectors employed by the Austrian government will not be published, will not be spoken, will not be allowed. And this is going to set the stage for just increasing numbers of secret police that are placed throughout the German Confederation to eliminate political opposition of the monarchies. There's conservative in Austria, the German Confederation, and Prussia. Well, let's go to Britain. In Great Britain, they're dealing with some different situations, and their situations are more economic than politically based. So after the Napoleonic Wars were over, Britain is faced with a pretty significant issue. All of their soldiers who had been fighting in the wars come home, and when they come home, they don't have jobs. What we see is an attempt by the British government and by Lord Liverpool to provide more jobs for the British people, but it ends up kind of blowing up in its face. So during this time period, during the early stages, or I guess the late stages of the Napoleonic War, Britain starts going through the early stages of the Industrial Revolution. Their agricultural industry is changing at a tremendous pace. They only need a fraction of the number of employees they used to produce even more food than they did prior. So, not realizing this, the Prime Minister of Britain at the time, a guy by the name of Lord Liverpool, enacts something called the Corn Act. This Corn Act actually places high tariffs on any imported grain and corn from the rest of Europe or other territories. The idea behind this was that it would protect the corn farmers in Great Britain and encourage them to produce more corn, provide more jobs for these soldiers, but the reality is that they didn't need these new soldiers. And this is actually going to start to really tear apart society, because if you remember, or if you haven't watched the video later on about classical economics, you actually realize the iron law of wages really applies here. The more workers there are, they kind of drives down the wages that takes place. And these people will start undercutting each other for the minimum work that they get, and we have a significant problem. The people are either impoverished or incredibly rich, and that creates a situation. And then, after this takes place, a set of taxes comes out that really cripples the elites in Britain during this time period, and they take a huge hit, and everything's starting to really struggle economically. And it's not because the nation is doing poorly, and this is what's kind of weird. Britain is doing great economically, but individual people are struggling. And this is a hallmark of the early industrial stage. A lot of people are going to struggle early on for money at all, except for some really wealthy elites. And that's now happening in Britain. So what do these people do? Well, they start to become unsettled. And when they become unsettled, we start to see people questioning the government. And a series of laws is passed in Britain called the Coercion Acts. And these are designed to prevent people from getting together in ideas and come up with concepts about overthrowing the government of Britain. Well, the people are outraged by these Coercion Acts. And they meet and protest. And this protest breaks into a massacre where the British government comes in and kills a lot of the protesters. We call this the Peterloo Massacre. And Britain is now going through the first real political trouble it's had in quite a while. How they deal with this? Well, they double down on conservatism. And Lord Liverpool is going to enact more laws, called the Six Acts, that are going to make it harder and harder to spread liberal messages around Britain. It makes it more expensive for newspapers to run. It makes it more financially damaging if you're caught posting anything that might be libel, which is false statements in written print. It speeds up trials against political agitators, forbids large public meetings. All of these things are going to be viewed as just the antithesis of what Europe is at this point in time. But that's the trend, and that's how Britain is dealing with the growing liberal movement in its nation. Well, then there's France. France has the wonderful pleasure of working with Louis XVIII. If you remember, after Napoleon comes back for a hot second, he is then banished to St. Helens, and Louis XVIII comes back to France as the established monarch in the nation. And when he does come back to France, he realizes that he can't just get rid of the French Revolution. There's no way to just go back and pretend like it didn't happen. So he's going to try to come up with a moderate solution called the Charter. The Charter is supposed to institute some of the liberal reforms of the French Revolution while maintaining a lot of the conservative institutions that existed prior. Well, how does this work? Well, there will now be an established national legislature as established in the French Revolution. It'll have two houses, a House of Peers, which will be appointed by Louis, pretty much exclusively nobles, and a Chamber of Deputies, which will be elected from landowners. Small progress, but for all intents and purposes, this is kind of similar to the States General. The only thing that's now significant about this, as opposed to what it was before, is that the clergy is kept out of this entirely. That division between church and state is still pretty significant in France and will stay that way. There's also new rules that'll take place. Religious toleration kind of exists as long as you are a Christian. If you are not Christian, you are still clearly not welcome. And new landowners that had gained land during the time of Napoleon get to maintain that control of land. So that's good. But it's still a very small step. People aren't going to be happy with this. This is not the liberal institutions that they really fought for in the French Revolution. This is just like putting the Twinkie in front of their face and just keeping it just far enough away that they can't reach it. So people are a little upset about this. Well, people are upset not only at the fact that this is such a small aspect of liberalism that they're getting, there is also a significant chunk of France that is upset that Louis is caving in at all. The fact that he is giving anything to the liberal demands of the people of France infuriates some members of the aristocracy, including a man by the name of the Count of Artois. He is connected to the monarchy, and he is going to begin a movement called ultra-royalism, where he is pushing for all aspects of the French Revolution to be eradicated from France. And this is going to be a bit of a disaster in France in the upcoming future. People will die, and ultra-royalism will leave a pretty bloody mark on French history. So yeah, stop your current actions. My timepiece indicates a necessity for mallets, and we're done.